Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video we're going to accomplish two goals. First, we're going to clean up and label our app.js even better than we already did. I'm sure you figured it out by now, but I am kind of anal about my labeling. And we're also, and more importantly in my opinion, we're going to create a function that's going to seed our database with items every time that we start the server. So for the first item, our app.js continues to change. It continues to add more things and expand a little bit, so I'm going to add a little bit more comments and some more structure to make it easier to read and to work with. So I'm going to create kind of a little header here. Imports. We've got our npm imports, we got our config import, we've got our route imports, our model imports, and then after that I'm going to do development. These are the things that are only going to be done for our dev server. So for example, the Morgan. Morgan here is only used inside of our dev server. Once we actually push to production, we're not going to have Morgan in there. Also, we're going to seed the database, which we're going to do as the second part of this video. Copy this again. And after development, we're going to have our config section. So we're going to connect to our database. And instead of just having an overall config, we're going to do an express config where we're setting up EJS and we're setting our static there. Body parser config. Method override config, and then route config. And you could put the route config in with the express config if you wanted to, but I like to have it separate. And then the last little section is going to be listen. So we really didn't change much. We just moved a couple things around and added the big headers. Just makes it easier to work with. This is not something that you would have to do, generally speaking, with an application of this size because your app.js is already relatively short, but it's a good practice to get into. It's a good habit to get into so that you can do that whenever you're working with much larger full-scale applications. And that's it for our app.js for now. The second thing I said we were going to do is we're going to seed the database with items. As of right now, we have finally implemented the ability to delete things. Now, this will get super annoying in the long run because whenever you delete all of your things, you need more data to work with. So you have to come in, add a comment, fill out that whole form with a bunch of different data. If you want your actual images, you have to go find an image and paste it in there. If you want actual data inside of here, you have to find it and you have to paste it. It's a giant pain in the butt. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to make a function that we're going to call every time our server restarts, and it's going to create 3 different comics, and it's going to create a comment on each of those comics. So this function is just going to be broken out into its own file, and it's basically a utility function. Oftentimes you'll have a bunch of different utility functions that do different things. We don't have any yet other than this one, but oftentimes you'll see that in a utils directory. So we're going to make directory utils, and then touch utils /seed.js. I'm just going to call it seed. You could call it seed database or database seeds or something like that. And there's nothing in here, obviously. So what we need to do is we're going to do this in a few different steps. First, we need to delete all the current comics and comments. Then we need to create 3 new comics. Finally, we need to create a new comment for each comic. So before we do any of that, I'm just going to create a blank function that just console.log something and then import it into app.js to make sure it's actually running. So let's do const, seed equals console.log seed db. Now remember, because this isn't a separate file, we have to do module.exports equals seed. So inside of app.js, we are going to import this. And I could import it up here in maybe the config import or something like this, but I'm just going to keep it inside the development so that when we go to push to production, I can just delete all of the development and not have to worry about finding the import up here. So const seed equals require /utils/seed, and then call seed as a function. So let's do no daemon, see if it works. There we go, seeddb. So we know that this function is being called from within app.js. So in order to create, before we actually get started with all this, we need some data. We need to find our the data that we're going to use to actually populate it. So I'm going to create const, maybe do seeds or I don't know, comic seeds. I like that, it's a little bit more clear. It's just going to be an array, and I have already gotten a bunch of information for the 3 comics that we have been using this whole time. And I'm just going to paste that in so that you don't have to sit here and watch me type all that crap out. Obviously, since you're not using comics, you're going to have your own information, use your own stuff. But it's just objects that have the key value pairs of all the information that we have. So save that. Nothing really is going to change. Next thing, we need to import all of our models because we can't work with them until we import them. So const comic equals require. We have to go into, got to go up a level because we're in utils, go up to the root level, /models/comic, and const comment equals require models/comment. Got both of those, and I'm just going to copy my comments down below and put that inside my seed function because that's where the magic is going to happen. Now this is the point where I'm going to have to do something I hadn't planned on doing when I planned this course, and honestly up until a few videos ago I hadn't really planned on doing this. We're going to talk for a brief moment about async await. Let me pull up some information about async await. This is a really cool article that goes over it pretty well. Async await explained in 10 minutes, but basically let's just read over this first paragraph because it makes it pretty clear. For the longest time, JavaScript developers had to rely on callbacks for working with asynchronous code. As a result, many of us experience callback hell, and the horror one goes through when faced with functions looking like this. Lots of fun. Thankfully, promises came. They offer a much more organized alternative to callbacks, and most of the community moved to using them instead. Now, with async await, writing JavaScript has gotten even better. Now, we haven't really talked about promises. You've heard me mention them, and basically what I told you is we're not going to be able to talk about them. We don't have time to talk about them. But to briefly refresh your memory about what we talked about earlier, promises are a way for you to run your JavaScript code asynchronously, for you to make a request to something else, wait for that request to finish, and then do something with it. Instead of running your code line by line by line, if you do a promise, that'll make a request to whatever API or whatever you're wanting to do with your promise, and then your code will keep running in the background while it waits for that. Once that comes back, then that promise will run, it'll resolve. This can cause problems in our code. For example, inside of, let's go to comics, we're using .thens, but let's say that we wanted to find a comic, because this runs asynchronously. Let's say we wanted to find a comic, and then we wanted to render a page based on the found comics. But what if we tried to render that page before our comic promise came back, before we got this resolved? We would render a blank page because there wouldn't be any comics because we hadn't gotten the answer from this yet. Now, we're able to get around this using the .then and things like that, but sometimes that can cause additional problems when you have a bunch of chained .thens or .thens inside of .thens and things like that, kind of like with the show page down here where we have a comment inside of a comic .then and we had to use a callback. It gets a little messy. So what async allows us to do is there's 2 keywords, async and await. Async, you include that in front of your function declaration. So you just add the word async. And basically what it does is it transforms this function into an asynchronous function. And this is ways for us to guarantee that it returns a promise. Whenever these functions are done, they resolve with whatever is returned in their body, and they also allow you to use await, or await if you want. This is what we're most interested in because honestly we don't have time to learn much about promises. We just don't have time. But we are very interested in the await, because that way it allows us to pause our code. Whenever await is placed in front of a promise call, it forces the rest of the code to wait until that promise finishes. So it's a way for us to guarantee that this will not run, none of this will run, until this comes back. That's the part we care about. It only works with promises, it does not work with callbacks, and it can only be used inside of async functions. If you try and do await outside of an async function, it'll throw a syntax error and it won't run. Now again, I had not planned on doing async await in the interest of time. However, it makes it so much easier to do many things, especially seeding the database and also getting both comic and comments. So I wanted to go ahead and talk about it. We're going to spend a little bit more time in the next module refactoring some stuff to use async and await, but just be aware that we are barely brushing the surface. Even after the next module, when we use it a few times, we're still not going very deep. And this is just in the interest of time because I don't want to overload you with all of these new concepts and things like that. So that's a very brief introduction to async. So let's go ahead and build out our seed using async await. So the way that it works is const seed equals async before our function declaration. See, our function declaration is right here, or if you're using traditional function, it'd be like that. But we're not, we're using arrow functions. The reason we have to do async, as I said before, is it enables us to use await. So to delete all the comments, we're going to use our first await, or await. Await comic.delete many. And that's it. That's all we have to do to delete all the comics. Now, if we did not have await here, this is running, and let's say we created new comments, or new comics rather, this might not have finished by the time our comics are created, so this might still be running and continue to delete all these comics we just created. That's why we have to do await, because that way this will stop the rest of this from running until this is done. So comic right here is going to return a promise, and then our code is going to pause until this promise is done, until this function, if you will, is finished running. And I'm just going to console.log deleted all the comics. And now we need to delete all the comments. And we're going to use another await. Await comment.delete many. And delete many, by the way, you can look up in the Mongoose documentation. If you just call it by itself, it'll delete all of them, but you can also pass search parameters in here, filter parameters to only delete specific things. Console.log deleted all the comments. So that's already done. So now we need to create 3 comics. Traditionally speaking, and generally speaking, the way that you would do this is using a for each loop. So comic seeds dot for each. So for each seed, do the thing. Create the comic. Unfortunately, if we do this, we can't use await stuff inside of here because this is another function. We would have to make this an async function, and that can cause problems because we're creating async inside of async, and it's a pain in the butt. So instead of doing a for each, there's another syntax to use. It's the for of loop. For of. The syntax for that is for const seed of comic seeds. Do something. So you'll see that here's for variable or constant of your array. So this variable here, you can name it whatever you want. So actually, I'm not going to use seed because that's the name of the outer function. It won't cause a problem, but it's not a good idea to do that. For comic seed of comic seeds, do something. So inside of here, we're going to await comic.create comic seed. Now remember, the comic seed is one of these things. Each one of these is a single comic seed based on our for of loop, for comic seed of this array, of the array up there. So for item in the array. So we're going to create a new comic based off of that JavaScript object. After it's done, we're going to create a comic. Await comment.create. And now we can pass in the items for our comments. Our comments, we have a text. I roved this Romic rook. From the user, Scooby-Doo. But you'll also remember we have to have the comic ID. And right now we would have a problem getting that comic ID because we don't have any way to access it. So what we have to do here is we have to create a couple variables. Let comic equal that. So now that we've done that, we can add that onto here. So we can just come through here and do comic ID is going to be comic underscore dot underscore ID. We know this is going to finish first because we are awaiting it. Then this is going to run. That's the only reason we can use this in here, because if this was not await, this may or may not finish before we try and run this. So oftentimes you might run into this being undefined because this hadn't finished running yet. That's why we have to use the await. So we're creating a comic, and then we are creating a comment on that comic. So let's add a couple console.logs just to kind of keep track of how this goes. Console.log created a new comic. And let's log that comic out, actually. Log out comic. Let's not log the whole thing, let's do the title. That way we can still tell that they're different. And then after the comment goes, let's console.log created a new comment. This comment goes up here. All right, now let's run this and see if it works. Watch in the console. Running, boom, 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 boom. Deleted all the comics, deleted all the comments, created Watchman, created a comment. Created Batman, created a comment, created Y, created a comment. So now if we come into here and we refresh this page, this will not load. Think about why this will not load. The reason is because the ID is different. Right now we're on an old ID that's no longer in the database because we deleted it right here. We recreated Watchman, but it's going to have a different ID. So if I refresh this page, it didn't work. There's nothing here. What in the heck's going on? It doesn't work. Instead, go to Comics, and now you go to Watchman, and there it is. Now you'll notice that the image is still broken because we still haven't updated that image. Let's see, where's my, yep, I did it wrong here. So image link, save. This will refresh. It will delete all the old items in the database and create new ones. So let's go back to comics. There we go. Now it works. On each one, let's say I delete this. Bye-bye. Let's delete this one. Bye-bye. Let's delete this one. Bye-bye. Now I don't have any more comics. Oh no, I'm sad, and I would have to go through this whole form. Instead, all I have to do is shut down my server, start it over again, refresh, go to comments, they're all back. This will make our life so much easier when we are testing things. From here on, until we disable this function, we're going to have new items every single time we restart. In this video, we did a couple different things. First off, we cleaned up and labeled our app.js to make it a little bit easier to read, and then we created a seed the database function. In order to do that, we imported our models, created an array of objects here, that's just our data, and then we created this seed function. This seed function is an asynchronous function. It's got the async keyword, and inside of there we use the await keyword, or await, however you want to pronounce it, to force our code to stop running, to not continue on until this operation finishes. That's very important whenever you're working with things that run asynchronously, like your Mongoose calls, because it forces your code to stop, and you can guarantee that it'll be done before the rest thing hits. This is very important because if you are running your code and this operation doesn't finish and you're still doing other things, it can cause problems. Like, for example, if delete was still running while we tried to create new ones, it would just delete the new ones, and we would never get the new ones out. We're going to talk more in the next module about async and await, and you're going to get a little bit more practice using them. But again, we're only going to brush the surface. We're not going to go deep into them in the interest of time. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to help. Thanks.